Today at the National Press Club, Communications Minister Michelle Rowland, a member of federal parliament since 2010 and before that, a lawyer specialising in telecommunications, media and technology. Michelle Rowland with today's National Press Club address.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the National Press Club and the Westpac Address, coming to you from Ngunnawal and Ngambri country, Canberra. My name's Laura Tingle, I'm the club's president. There was a time when the day-to-day concerns of a communications minister would be dominated by the major media proprietors and their tussles for control of print and electronic media. It was always high-stakes politics, and the media barons still like to throw their weight around. The concerns these days, however, are much more complex in the dispersed age of power, information and disinformation on social media and amid the rise of artificial intelligence. And it's particularly true in times like the present, when we are witnessing devastating conflict in the Middle East. To discuss these issues and no doubt take questions on a much wider range of topics from my journalistic colleagues, please welcome the Minister for Communications, Michelle Rowland, to the podium for her first address to the National Press Club.
Good afternoon. I acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. I particularly extend that respect to any First Nations people joining us, including Ms Dot West, OAM, and Dr Lyndon Orman-Parker, the Chair and Deputy Chair respectively of the First Nations Digital Inclusion Advisory Group. This is my first address to the National Press Club, and it is the greatest privilege to serve as Minister for Communications in the Albanese Government. Shareholder Minister for the two great government business enterprises, NBN Co and Australia Post. Custodian of the national broadcasters, the ABC and SBS, the telecommunications sector, the broadcasting sector, the media industry, classification, and of course, online safety. In choosing to share with you today my reform program and initiatives to improve online safety, I also want to acknowledge some facts. While this issue is of great significance to all Australians, I note the recent research commissioned by my department, which shows that at 58%, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are far more likely to experience online harms in general than the non-Indigenous population at 32%. 58% compared to 32%. Both of these figures are unacceptable, as is the gap between them. I am dedicated to addressing these harms and improving digital inclusion for First Nations Australians more generally. Growing up in Layla Park near Blacktown in the 1970s, I consumed all aspects of communications that existed at the time. I watched the 1 public and 3 commercial channels on the TV. I used a rotary dial telephone at home, and I always carried 20-cent coins in case I needed to use a payphone. Mail arrived in our letterbox, and I made mixtapes from my favourite radio stations. But the moment when communications would really impact on my daily life, it was around 6 p.m. every weeknight. That's when my dad, circulation manager at John Fairfax and Sons, would walk through our front door with a bag of newspapers from around Australia and elsewhere. It was a window into a new world of opportunities and ideas. I would pore over these newspapers for hours, like many of us scroll on our various devices today. Australians have had access to the internet for over 30 years now. By the 1990s, telecommunications was our fastest growing industry, and Australia had the second highest internet take-up rate, just behind the United States. And since then, Australians have consistently been early adopters of new technology. We know that communications and connectivity are drivers of productivity and can be a game changer for families and small businesses, particularly in regional areas. For outer metropolitan areas, where I naturally take a keen interest, representing some of the fastest growing suburbs in Australia, The impact on livability, access to opportunity, and household productivity is life-changing. This is why I'm passionate about communications and why I'm so fortunate to have worked in the sector for 23 years as a legal practitioner, a legislator, and now as Minister. Much has changed in that time, but when it comes to how I think about the fundamentals of policy and law, some principles hold true. Regulation should be proportionate and not stifle innovation. But most importantly, it needs to be human-centred. Over the years, network engineers and software engineers have taken the time to explain to me how things work in a technical sense. Everything from packet switching to Wi-Fi to ChatGPT. And the simple foundational fact, within a complex network of networks, there is rarely a neat solution to a challenge. While the technology itself is complex, that pales in comparison to the interactions and collaborations enabled by it, and the deeply human impacts this has, both positive and negative. While technology can offer a young person connection to community and opportunities to build their confidence and sense of identity, it can also present difficult and potentially harmful experiences. And just as the technical problem solvers taught me, with policy making in the online space, there is also rarely a single solution. We can't put up the Great Firewall of Australia or switch off every service that facilitates a bad experience. But it is not beyond our wit to make things safer. The most critical task I have is to support innovative communications service provision that is in the public interest, that helps lift people up and make the country better while minimising harms and respecting community standards. So today I want to do three things. I will share what we are learning about new and emerging harms. I will provide an overview of how our current frameworks are performing. And finally, I will talk about the initiatives we are undertaking in this part of the portfolio to make our online spaces safer, more inclusive and cohesive. In 1993, a Senate report found there were complex regulatory problems involved with the availability of pornographic images on computer bulletin boards accessible by a home computer and modem. In announcing a task force investigation in response, the Labor government of the day noted, "We are in an era where children operate computers as easily as their parents rode bicycles. We cannot allow advances in technology to overtake the legal and law enforcement measures designed to protect them, in particular from undesirable material." That same statement could be made today. 3 decades later, through social media posts, direct messages, stories, snaps and more, the vectors for harm have not only expanded, but their ability to scale has increased. At the same time, companies with net worths exceeding the GDP of some nations have also been making decisions that impact billions of users. By sheer size, market dominance and influence, these platforms are also the site of a huge information asymmetry and power imbalance. Many platforms have taken on some responsibility, establishing terms of service and content policies to address online harms, but it is clearly not enough. Perpetrators continue to use these platforms to do harm. As David Kay, former UN Special Rapporteur, said of the digital platforms, they have become institutions of governance, complete with generalised rules and bureaucratic features of enforcement. They have struggled to figure out how to police content at the scale to which they've grown. This is not to say that the online world is an ungoverned space. It has been regulated for some time. Australia has actually been at the forefront of efforts to regulate the internet, to assert our sovereign values and expectations in the online environment. However, our regulatory framework has been incomplete. Privacy is a prime example. When the offer of free email addresses appeared in the mid-1990s, first with Hotmail and Yahoo and eventually everyone else, there was hardly any resistance. We were excited by the novelty, despite the fact we were handing over a significant amount of personal information. Today, we've lost count of how many times we've clicked agree to lengthy privacy notices as we download the next new app. A global game of catch-up is now occurring on a range of fronts, including competition, privacy, and online safety. I note my colleague, the Attorney-General, is taking forward a critical piece of work to update Australia's privacy framework for the digital age. Regarding my approach when it comes to online safety, there are three anchors. First, addressing the power and information imbalance by increasing the transparency and accountability of platforms and services, and empowering our regulators to hold them to account. For example, the Basic Online Safety Expectations Determination under the Online Safety Act empowers the eSafety Commissioner to require online service providers to report on how they are addressing user safety. Another example includes the government's proposed Combating Misinformation and Disinformation Bill. It would empower the Australian Communications and Media Authority to look under the hood of the digital platforms and improve transparency about the systems and processes they have in place to protect Australians, including how they comply with the voluntary code they signed up to. I acknowledge two regulators in my portfolio who are here today: the eSafety Commissioner, Julia Inman-Grant, and Authority Member Adam Suckling, representing the Chair of the ACMA, Ms Nerita O'Loughlin, PSM. To ensure reasonable protections are built into the platforms, we need transparency around industry's processes and actions, and I'll return to this theme later in my speech. Second, acknowledging the way harms manifest in the online environment is different to how they manifest offline, and that informs policy settings. There is a difference between a young person having a bad experience in the schoolyard and being subjected to a deluge of round-the-clock abuse and harassment over social media. There is a difference between visiting a local pub and placing a bet and being home alone betting online. There is a difference between how information spreads when it is shared between neighbours to when it goes viral on social media. This is not to say that one is more benign than the other, just that it is critical we understand these differences so we can be intentional about the appropriate regulatory settings that should apply. Third, together with industry, we need to lean on researchers and experts as they better understand associated impacts on human physiology and psychology. And the evidence is concerning. The ASIO Director General's annual threat assessment released last year highlighted that the number of minors being radicalised is getting higher, while the age of the minors being radicalised is getting lower, with children as young as 13 now embracing extremism, and critically, that most of the radicalisation occurs online. A recent Flinders University study on years 7 to 9 found that the time those young people spent using image-based platforms such as Instagram and Snapchat was associated with significantly higher disordered eating behaviours. And in relation to online scams, older Australians continue to lose more money than other age groups. According to ScamWatch, in 2022, people aged 65 and over made the most reports and lost more money than any other age group, with over $120 million reported as lost. Understanding these very real impacts of online harms will help industry build in the right user empowerment controls, education and supports to keep people safe. While today's address focuses on the industry and regulatory responses to online safety, it is also critical we invest to empower citizens with the digital and media literacy skills they need to navigate the online environment. In our budget, we provided $6 million over 3 years for online learning tools through a partnership with the Alana and Madeline Foundation. By 2025, every primary and secondary school in Australia will have the opportunity to engage with the Foundation's digital literacy products for free. Industry has strong incentives to create safe products and services for users. Virtually all the evidence will demonstrate that there's a virtuous cycle here. The safer your product, the better experience for consumers, which improves reputation and all the benefits that ensue. And because industry knows their own systems, they are best placed to build in safety from the outset. I acknowledge the great work done by the eSafety Commissioner with industry to support safety by design. Meanwhile, governments have a strong incentive to balance industry innovation while promoting safety. The existing framework under the Online Safety Act provides a backstop when industry has failed to remedy harm. It also seeks to prevent harm through education and awareness raising, and by putting requirements on industry to take proactive measures to promote safety. The Act, which came into effect in January 2022, gives eSafety the power to take down harmful content, such as cyberbullying of children, intimate images shared without consent, cyber abuse targeting adults, and illegal content. It also requires industry to develop mandatory codes that address illegal and seriously harmful content and protect children from age-inappropriate material. And eSafety can develop mandatory industry standards if the Commissioner determines the draft codes don't provide appropriate community safeguards. Just this week, eSafety opened consultation on 2 draft standards to cover apps, websites and storage devices, as well as messaging services, online dating services and gaming. In the last financial year, eSafety facilitated the removal of image-based abuse material from more than 6,500 locations. They held 225 workshops supporting Australian women online and had over 300,000 visitors to their learning portal to support older Australians. That's why in the budget, the Albanese government quadrupled ongoing baseline funding for eSafety, including by rolling terminating measures into base funding. The regulator now has the stability and certainty it needs to carry out its critically important work. Governments around the globe are dealing with the question of effective digital platform regulation and how to grapple with new risks and harms. International cooperation remains an important feature of internet governance. We saw this most recently at the AI Safety Summit in the UK, where Australia, along with the EU and 27 countries, became signatories to the Bletchley Declaration, affirming that AI should be designed and developed in a manner that is safe, human-centric, trustworthy and responsible. And I'm pleased to share today that Australia is in the advanced stages of establishing a new online safety and security memorandum of understanding with the United Kingdom, a first between our 2 countries. The MOU will step up our bilateral engagement across a range of issues, from child safety and age assurance to technology-facilitated abuse, as well as user privacy and misinformation, and responding to emerging technologies like generative AI. This form of engagement means we can share and learn from our close allies to ensure our regulatory interventions are measured, targeted and evidence-based. Turning back to our own shores, the government has been focused on addressing some immediate gaps in our online safety framework. Earlier this year, I convened the National Roundtable on Online Dating Safety in response to concerning research about abuse or harassment occurring over online dating platforms. The roundtable brought together advocacy groups, state governments, victim survivors, law enforcement and dating sites, major global platforms including Bumble and Match Group. This was the first time some of these dating apps had engaged with the government. Even before the event took place, platforms started to make announcements about new safety features. However, following an information request I issued to industry in March, it was evident there were still gaps in safety policy and processes. That's why, in September, I formally requested dating platforms operating in Australia to develop a new voluntary industry code to better protect Australian users. Dating industry representatives met earlier this week to progress this work, with support from my department, and I look forward to an update on next steps. The truth is, the dating apps are offering a hugely popular service. It's now the most common way to meet someone in Australia, but Australians need to be able to do so safely. I have been clear that the code is to be in place by the middle of next year, and industry knows it must improve the safety of Australians or we will regulate them. This setting of clear expectations and driving transparency around industry's actions is a fundamental component of Australia's online safety approach. The Basic Online Safety Expectations Determination sets out the government's core expectations for the online industry and provides a clear message about our priorities and the steps industry can take to address them. The E-Safety Commissioner can require online service providers to report on how they are meeting any or all of the expectations. Since last August, E-Safety has issued 3 rounds of reporting notices to 12 companies covering 27 different services, shining new light on what they are doing to counter child exploitation and abuse and hateful content. Since issuing these notices, we have seen some of our most popular platforms introduce new safety policies to address this horrific material. This demonstrates the efficacy of the framework in putting pressure on industry to do more of their own accord. The information received through these reports also gives government a critical evidence base about the need for further reforms. But it's clear there is more industry can do on harms not explicitly set out in the current expectations. That's why today I announced that the Albanese government will commence consultation to strengthen Australia's basic online safety expectations, to address gaps, emerging harms, and further clarify the government's expectations of industry. Under the proposed changes, services using generative AI would explicitly be expected to proactively minimise the extent to which AI can be used to produce unlawful and harmful material. We are also proposing a new expectation that industry consider the best interests of children in the design and operation of their services. This could include implementing appropriate age assurance mechanisms and technologies to prevent children from accessing age-inappropriate material. The government received the E-Safety Commissioner's Age Verification Roadmap earlier this year. The roadmap noted that the age assurance industry and associated technologies are new and still evolving and come with privacy, security, and implementation risks. However, it is also clear that some age assurance technologies and complementary measures are being deployed effectively across commercial platforms to prevent a range of harms to children. We want to see industry continue to develop and invest further in these technologies. Consultation on the proposed amendments commences today, and I invite submissions before the 16th of February 2024. I also want to touch on another proposed reform in my portfolio that addresses a gap in our existing regulatory framework: the Exposure Draft Bill to tackle seriously harmful misinformation and disinformation on digital platforms. The overwhelming majority of Australians are concerned about misinformation, nearly 70%, according to the Digital News report by the University of Canberra. The government's draft bill, which was released for public consultation, would empower the ACMA to hold digital platforms to account with new information gathering, record keeping, code registration, and standard making powers. This would improve transparency about the decisions platforms already make about harmful content on their services. Digital platforms are not passive. Social media companies manage content on their services every single day. Australians deserve to know more about what content is flagged, demoted, or taken down. This is about better understanding the systems and processes industry have in place. Spread online at speed and scale, both misinformation and disinformation, can cause serious harm, sow divisions within the community, undermine trust, and threaten public health and safety. Indeed, the potential for the spread of AI-generated mis and disinformation makes taking action even more pressing. The risks here were well understood by my predecessor, Paul Fletcher, who announced that his government would legislate to give the regulator new information gathering and enforcement powers in this area. We supported him at the time and remain committed to the policy, and for good reason. We are talking about harmful misinformation spread during a global pandemic that claimed millions of lives, about cancer misinformation that prevents a patient from seeing their doctor during the critical time when recovery is still possible, and disinformation spread by bad actors who want to undermine our democracy. It was recently reported the Chief of the Defence Force said disinformation operations have the potential to fracture and fragment entire societies. And as former ACCC Chair Rod Sims wrote recently, doing nothing in this area would represent an abrogation of responsibility by government. I thank stakeholders for the feedback provided during consultation. We are working through those submissions in earnest, and in particular, the feedback on definitions and exemptions, and expect to make some changes to the draft bill before it is introduced to the Parliament next year. A solid evidence base is important to inform government's approach to addressing online harms, particularly for those who are most vulnerable. In the last 12 months, I have introduced several gambling harm minimisation measures, including launching BetStop, the National Self-Exclusion Register, agreeing new mandatory minimum classifications for games with gambling-like features, and introducing legislation to ban the use of credit cards for online wagering. On BetStop, since its launch less than 3 months ago, nearly 13,000 Australians have already self-excluded from online wagering. Over half of those who've registered are between the ages of 18 and 30, and 40% have elected to self-exclude for a lifetime. This is critical protection when it comes to helping people stay safe from gambling-related harm. This is in addition to the government's work to implement consistent gambling messaging, wagering staff training, and mandatory customer pre-verification. But more needs to be done. That's why in September last year, we referred an inquiry into online gambling harm and its impacts to a House committee which has now made 31 recommendations, which are informing the government's consideration of further gambling reforms. In relation to gambling advertising, I am, like many Australians, concerned about the extent and the impact of gambling ads. I've been working with my department to understand how we can practically implement reforms and engaging with a wide range of stakeholders: media, digital platforms, sporting codes, and harm reduction advocates. We all know that the online gambling industry has grown and changed in recent years, and that some sporting codes now rely heavily on online gambling revenue. But my priority is clear. It is harm reduction. We haven't made any final decisions yet, but I appreciate the constructive input from all stakeholders as we consider next steps. I, along with the Minister for Social Services, look forward to outlining our agenda to further address gambling harms. As we near the end of my address, I want to reflect on a point I made earlier. New harms have emerged, and some known harms have intensified. We need to ensure our legislative framework does more than just play catch-up and incentivises platforms to have protections built in. While the Online Safety Act provides protections for individuals who have been targeted by seriously harmful online abuse, there is no mechanism to address harmful abuse directed at communities on the basis of their religion or their ethnicity. There is deep concern across the community about the way hateful language spreads online, including recent reporting about the rise in anti-Semitic and Islamophobic rhetoric. Over the past 2 years, it's also become harder to distinguish between AI-generated images and genuine ones. And while this technology has incredible potential as a positive tool, it has also been used to create images designed to humiliate, embarrass, or even abuse others. Australia needs our legislative framework to be strong, but also flexible enough to respond to an ever-evolving space. Earlier this year, I said I would bring forward the statutory review of the Online Safety Act by a year. And today, I'm pleased to announce that I have appointed Ms Delia Rickard, PSM, to lead a comprehensive review of the Online Safety Act, with public consultation to commence next year. Ms Rickard has extensive experience in regulating consumer harms and is highly regarded for her efforts to promote a safer online environment through regulating scams. As the Deputy Chair of the ACCC for more than 10 years, she witnessed firsthand the changing digital landscape and how the vectors for harm have become increasingly sophisticated. The review will be broad-ranging and include consideration of the overarching policy objectives of the Act. It will look at the effectiveness of the complaint schemes, the operation of the regulatory tools, and identify gaps in the legislation. The review will consider whether regulatory approaches being adopted internationally, including the duty of care approach that is progressing in the UK, should be adopted in the Australian context. I welcome the involvement of all interested parties as Ms Rickard undertakes this work. Back in the 1970s, when I was immersing myself in news and content the analogue way, my parents didn't worry so much because they knew and understood what I was looking at. Today, our children get online, and parents and legislators are rightly concerned because we know that the content kids can access and the connections they can make through games, video sites and social networks are vast and too often unchecked. The way governments and regulators go about keeping citizens safe from online harms cannot be set and forget. The Albanese government is committed to realising improvements to communications to make Australians' lives better and expand opportunity, supporting people to connect, work flexibly, be entertained, transact, do business, learn and play safely. It must be an ongoing, careful exercise delivered together with industry, in step with changes in technology and in partnership with the health practitioners, experts, parents and communities. In the era of the digital giants, it is more important than ever that Australia asserts its values and the community standards we expect online, that we reaffirm our shared responsibility to protect citizens and consumers. That way, we can fully realise the benefits of the digital world. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Minister. You mentioned at one point reflected on the fact that we've had those experiences of harmful misinformation on the pandemic, on cancer, role of bad actors. Of course, social media internationally has played an extraordinary role in things like the January 6 attack on Congress. I just wondered, and you've talked about the capacity of all of this to fracture whole societies. Separate, if you like, from what governments can do about this, I just wondered whether you could reflect on the willingness and acceptance of those digital giants that they've got this social responsibility, and whether that has changed at all. I mean, we were seeing this week, fines being imposed on companies which, people are speculating won't be paid. Is there actually a real engagement by those digital companies, particularly given changes in ownership in recent times?
Thank you for your question. And I think it's critically important to recognise that the role of keeping Australians safe primarily rests with industry, with these platforms, but it's also a collective effort by government and civil society as well. And I think there are two key elements here. The first is, as I mentioned in my address, it is a virtuous cycle for platforms to build into their own systems the ability to keep users safe, to be able to understand those systems and processes. And to that very point, the industry has developed a voluntary code. That voluntary code is proposed to be codified so that we understand precisely what those platforms are doing, how they are meeting those expectations and rules that they have signed up to voluntarily. Because I've mentioned throughout my address how important transparency is when it comes to understanding the behaviour of these platforms. It's one of the key factors to address that power imbalance and that information asymmetry. It's a very important feature of e-safety and the Online Safety Act. But nothing exists in relation to looking under the hood of those digital platforms and understanding their systems and processes and requesting that they provide information about precisely what they are doing to meet those obligations. But I think the other important factor is this, and again I mentioned this in my address. It's so important, so critical to have appropriate digital literacy built up not just through children, but over the entire life cycle of the consumer. And that requires a number of steps to be made. Firstly, I think it is critical that the platforms invest in this themselves. It's also critical that governments, through a holistic approach, take action in this area. And to that end, I note that I have convened the Ministerial Council of Online Harms, so there is direct interaction across a variety of portfolios at a Commonwealth level, including education, home affairs and health. That's so that we understand, as a government as a whole, what we can be doing to encourage that safety right throughout the user experience on the platforms.
Just a follow-up. Given, though, as you say, we've seen this surge of Islamophobia and anti-Semitism on the platforms, doesn't that suggest that responsibility isn't being taken seriously and throw into question the idea that a voluntary code is sufficient?
I think you're correct, and that is why we are addressing this gap in the framework by updating the expectations to include what the platforms are doing in relation to their own policies about minimising the impact of hate speech. This is a gap in the regulatory framework. It's one that a number of jurisdictions are grappling with, and it's one that I look forward to taking measures on as part of this updating of the basic online safety expectations.
Tom Connell has a question.
Tom Connell from Sky News and here at the Press Club as well. It looks as though you are set to proceed with prominence laws to do with smart TVs. Your own policy paper on that said it would give free-to-air stations effectively an advantage in the streaming age. Is there any other policy area where one type of company is given advantage over another like that?
Well, thank you for your question. And I think there are two things that are important here. The first is that prominence was a policy that we took to the last election to legislate a prominence framework. But secondly, we are doing this as part of a broader media reform agenda to update our laws for the digital age. The reality is that smart devices, connected TVs, are not what we used to have when I was growing up. It's not a box sitting in the corner. It is a smart device which extrapolates large amounts of information. But importantly, it means that local Australian TV services have been made more difficult to find. So I'd like to answer your question in this way. I talked in my address about addressing market failure and being proportionate. This satisfies both. Not only does it ensure that we overcome this power imbalance that exists, but we also address the issue that's important from a cultural perspective, that we ensure Australians can access local television services more easily. And we know at this time that that is becoming more and more difficult and will only be exacerbated into the future.
So it's a market failure if free-to-air are not the most popular?
I don't think this is a question of popularity, and it's never been characterised in that way. This is about updating the regulatory framework for the digital age. As I said, we know that these smart devices are operating in a way that makes it difficult for Australians to access local TV services. That needs to be remedied, and it needs to be remedied in the long-term interests of consumers. Consumers are who we are most concerned about here, and that is why we took this as an election commitment as part of a suite of media reforms.
I'll leave it there and respect the President.
Thank you, Tom, since I was disrespecting my own rule. Sarah Eisen.
Sarah Eisen from The Australian. I just wanted to speak to the misinformation bill and particularly the exemptions that we might see there. We have seen in the last sort of week some talk about there being religious exemptions. Can you clarify what that would mean? If someone says something that is part of a religious belief, then that might be kind of carved out from a platform needing to take that down. And also, can you be clear if you will retain the exemption for political parties within a misinformation bill?
Well, as to your first question, we are working through these issues now as part of the consultation process. But it is a point that has been raised by several submitters. And again, I thank all the submitters who've taken the time to express their views on this issue. So we will work through precisely what those exemptions will be, but we understand that there has been concern from a variety of faith organisations that their religious views should not be considered as part of this rubric. So we are working through that at the moment, and we'll have more to say in due course. There have been calls for exemptions, in fact, to be removed, including when it comes to authorised election material and also as it applies to media services as well. I've made it clear that those exemptions are in there for a reason. It's because they are regulated elsewhere under different standards and under other laws. But in terms of any other exemptions, we will work through those as part of this consultation process. We have a large number of people who have made very detailed submissions, and we appreciate that, and we'll work through this.
So you're open to removing the exemption for political parties, not just electoral, but political parties being exempt from this? Are you open to removing that exemption?
Well, let me be clear, and if you're talking in particular about notices that can be given by government, which has been a source of contention, I want to be clear that that exemption was proposed to ensure that important emergency and otherwise official information from government that is important to people wasn't taken down or removed by digital platforms. We understand that that has been the subject of some misinterpretation. We want to get this drafting right, and we want to ensure that this reflects the proper intent, which is to hold the digital platforms to account for the policies, systems and processes that they have signed up to and they've already committed to.
Thank you.
Ron Myson.
Minister, thank you for your speech and congratulations on your first Press Club appearance. There's been reporting earlier this year and also last week about both yourself and Mr Albanese attending various events with gambling industry lobbyists. I just want to ask you, those events have been organised by the Federal Labor Business Forum, at which organisations pay a subscription fee for various levels of access. Do you as a minister have a choice about whether you attend those events, or are you required to?
I very much appreciate your question. It gives me the opportunity to acknowledge that there is a large amount of community concern in this area about the impacts of gambling and gambling advertising more generally, which I have covered in my address. I'd like to say from the outset that I have at all times and will continue to comply with all rules in relation to disclosure and donations, that every Member of Parliament must comply with this and every political party must comply with this. I intend to continue participating in fundraising activities and also meeting with a wide variety of stakeholders relevant to my portfolio. But at all times will I continue to comply with those disclosure requirements. I made an announcement earlier this year that I would no longer accept donations or hospitality from gambling companies. I have adhered to that promise and will continue to do so in future. I will also point out that in 18 months, the Albanese government has delivered more in terms of gambling reform and harm minimisation than any government before it, including the launch of BetStop, including banning the use of credit cards for online wagering, which actually passed the House of Representatives recently, and enacting the final provisions of the National Consumer Protection Framework. We have proof points that demonstrate our commitment and our delivery when it comes to harm minimisation. On the broader issue of donations and disclosure more generally, I know that my colleague, Minister Farrell, is undertaking an important piece of work in this area through JSCEM and is open to all ideas about how we can further improve democracy in this country.
Can I just clarify, is it voluntary or is it a requirement upon ministers to attend those events?
I choose to attend such events. I will continue to attend fundraising events, but I will always do so in accordance with donations and disclosure requirements. All political parties are required to do the same, and I think it is important to recognise the piece of work being undertaken by the government right now in order to update the rules that govern our democracy and make any changes that are deemed necessary to make it stronger.
Thank you.
Despite setting a very bad precedent, if I could ask you all to stick to one question so we can get through a lot more. Ben Westcott.
Ben Westcott from Bloomberg. Thank you very much for your speech, Minister. You've spoken in your speech about online gambling ads, and you said you're going to undertake consultation on it and look into it. But I mean, anyone who has been on YouTube recently will have been deluged with ads from a range of gambling services. You've already mentioned some of the harm minimisation measures you've undertaken. Why is this a complicated reform from your perspective? Why can't we just ban gambling ads online?
Thank you for your question. And it's one that is often proposed. It's one that is used in relation to, for example, the banning of tobacco ads many years ago. The reality is, again, as I outlined in my speech, over the years, the gambling industry and sport, for example, the relationship has very much changed. We know that the impact of gambling ads is felt right across the community, and the committee made some very important recommendations in that regard. In answer to your question, I'm consulting closely with a wide range of stakeholders because we need to understand the impacts in this area, but also what changes need to be made in order for it to be more robust in future. I would point out that the last substantive time that this was amended, actually under the Turnbull government, actually resulted in an increase in gambling advertising. So we need to ensure that we get the policy settings right. But I can assure you that we are at all times guided by the principles of harm minimisation. We're consulting widely with a range of experts in this area. We understand the community concern. I've made it clear that the status quo cannot continue, and we will have more to say on this in due course.
Thank you.
Rhys Alessandro.
Afternoon, Minister. Thank you for your address. Rhys Alessandro from 9 News. I too wanted to ask about prominence laws, and I understand you're taking a number of different views on the various elements of those laws on board. And so I wanted to ask you, when do you anticipate that framework will be finalised and any changes put before Parliament?
Thank you very much for your question. And as I said, updating our media laws to reflect the digital age is a key priority and one that we took to the election. And prominence, having a prominence framework in Australia is a key part of that. We expect to be introducing legislation this year on the issue, and this follows a detailed consultation process over the past 12 months.
Thank you.
Paul Sakal.
Hi, Minister. Thank you. Paul Sakal from the Nine Papers. I wanted to ask on age verification for porn websites. Child safety experts and women's safety experts have said you've gone soft on the industry and you're trusting them too much. I wondered on what basis do you trust the pornography industry to engage in a cooperative code? And just quickly, the issues you've gone through today, AI, hate speech, misinformation, they strike me as huge global behemoths. I wonder, are the advocates, many of whom are in this room, unreasonable in thinking that, you know, a communications minister can fix all these problems?
Thank you very much for your question. To the first part, there would be no decent-minded Australian who wants children to access age-inappropriate material, including pornography. I'm very grateful to the E-Safety Commissioner for undertaking an important piece of work with the age verification roadmap. As the Safety Commissioner noted, and as I alluded to in my address, the ability and the efficacy of the systems that currently exist for age verification are immature and also carry significant risks in terms of privacy and their ability to be implemented overall. What I have done as Minister in receiving that age verification report is take a detailed look at how we can most effectively prevent children from accessing that harmful material. And I want to be clear on this point. This isn't only about accessing pornographic sites. This is about the some 30% and growing of content that children see literally coincidentally. They stumble across this using online platforms. It's not something that they go looking for. It is incidental to their online experience. And therefore, what we are seeking to address is ensuring that the digital platforms have measures in place to minimise that from happening. If I take, for example, the case of Roblox, which is a popular service, parents are often led to believe that this is a safe service. But I note that there's at least one case on foot in the United States suing Roblox for not protecting children from seeing inappropriate material. What I want to do as Minister is utilise the powers that we have right now that are effective under the Online Safety Act. And I have asked the E-Safety Commissioner to commence work on the second tranche of codes to address pornographic content. This is critical for ensuring that the industry lifts its game. And as I also said, we want the industry to invest more in what we know can be effective age assurance technologies. So this is a multifaceted problem that regulators around the world are grappling with, which, to the second part of your question, actually goes to the precise point. Regulators around the world are dealing with these questions of online safety, of prominence, of ensuring that children don't access harmful content. And it is important that we undertake this in a cooperative manner, not only across governments and regulators, but we also do this across whole of government. And that is what we are seeking to do in this space to address those harms. We are not going to be a government who says that big tech is too big and we can't address this power imbalance in the interests of Australian consumers. We are determined to make things better.
Josh Butler.
Thanks, Minister. Josh Butler from The Guardian. I want to go back to the question that Ben Westcott asked about gambling ads online, and I guess especially ones that kids might be exposed to. I'm sort of thinking about, TikTok profiles where, a gambling company has, a social media influencer or a comedian or something, hosting, branded content, making funny videos and that sort of thing that then lead back to gambling. You've spoken about the age verification issue, and I guess also the consultation paper goes to the recommender, the search recommender sort of algorithms and that sort of thing. Could you talk a little bit, I guess, about how kids are being exposed to gambling ads online, and if it's appropriate, I guess, for kids to be talking about same game multis and bonus bet offers and those sort of things? Like, what more can be done in that sort of area, specifically around children?
No, thank you very much for your question. And you highlight the important point that when we talk about vulnerable Australians when it comes to gambling advertising, that we also consider that children are some of those vulnerable Australians as well. I think the main point to make here is that we are considering the recommendations of the committee's report into gambling promotions, and we are looking at this holistically. Not only across the broadcasting space, but across the whole range of recommendations that have been made. No decisions have been made yet, but I would like to share with you that throughout this consultation process, one thing we have been very focused on in understanding from advocacy and other experts is how harmful this is for children, where it appears, and what steps could be taken in response. But in addition to that, you make an astute point about what the platforms could be doing about minimising that access to those harms as well. We know that it is the platforms themselves who know more about their consumers than governments and regulators ever will. So we're continually looking at ways in which we can utilise the basic online safety expectations in order to meet those community standards, but most importantly, to keep vulnerable Australians safe, particularly children.
Thanks.
Melissa Code.
Hi Minister, Melissa Code from the Mandarin. This morning there was, in the strategic cybersecurity strategy, there was a recommendation that to strengthen cybersecurity obligations and compliance, the government was considering a proposal to introduce a last resort all hazard consequence management power. And given that communications is one of the 11 critical infrastructure branches, I was wondering if you could tell us whether you've been briefed on what that would look like in the telco space and what your role as Minister would be should that power need to be enlivened.
Thank you very much for your question, and it is very contemporary. My colleague Minister O'Neill announced this only recently, and it is an important step in updating Australia's cyber defences and having a broad whole-of-economy approach to those incidences of cyber security and breaches. The way in which the comms portfolio and home affairs portfolio interact are many and varied. But if I can take, for example, one such scenario, and that is in relation to critical network infrastructure and the ways in which we need to ensure that they are embedded in a manner that actually increases their ability to withstand those cyber attacks. So I'm working very closely with Minister O'Neill. It is through primarily the infrastructure parts of my portfolio where this operates, but in all cases, it is a whole-of-government approach again that we are taking here.
Andrew Brown.
Andrew Brown from AAP. Thanks so much for your speech, Minister. We've seen in recent years countless local, rural and regional papers have to force to close due to declining revenue and ever-increasing costs. Often many of these papers are the only source of news in that particular community. And while there have been one-off grants that the government has put through for printing costs, what else do you plan to do to help these rural and regional papers not only survive, but to thrive in a media environment? And when would we expect to see some sort of government policy strategy surrounding this?
Thank you very much for your question. And you highlight one of the key objectives of Australia's media landscape, which is to support localism and diversity in our media. It has been a long time that these experiences and these pressures on so many regional and outer metropolitan publications has existed. And exactly as you say, this government has undertaken a number of interventions, including assisting with immediate cash flow issues that were very well received by the sector as a whole, but also in supporting hyperlocal news content and helping them to adapt has also been an important area of funding. I expect to be announcing in the near future our NewsMap, our News Media Assistance Program. And that is based on research that has been informed by the ACMA's work around diversity and areas where for so many years we did not understand where these news deserts existed or where potential ones were emerging. So we will have more to say shortly in terms of our broader media reform program. But I also acknowledge that this is critical for democracy in some of these areas where often it is the one local publication that is really carrying the weight of supporting that diversity. We want to do everything we can as a government to enable that to thrive, but we need to do so in a measured way that is long-term as well. We've seen interventions in past years under previous governments which purported to set up the media industry for decades to come. But we know with the challenges of digitisation and the rise of the platforms that this has placed the sector under increasing stress. So I expect to make announcements in the near future, but I thank you very much for bringing to the attention, everyone's attention to this important issue of localism, especially in regional areas.
Jack Quayle.
Jack Quayle from the News Corp Wire. Minister, thank you very much for your address. My question goes to the future of the Sky Muster program. More than $650 million has been sunk into the program now, but it's increasingly uncompetitive to Elon Musk's Starlink. It's shedding customers there. We're seeing that as well, that users are suffering from very low speeds too. So I guess my question is, what do you see as the future of the program? Is the government going to continue sinking money into what is ageing infrastructure now?
Thank you very much for your question. It's actually really pertinent to consider the other interventions the government is making to ensure that rural and regional Australians in particular have access to the highest quality broadband services. The Albanese government has been investing in the NBN across all its technologies, upgrading copper to fibre, upgrading our fixed line network, but also investing in Sky Muster. What we have been able to do over this past year with NBN's investments in this area is enabled the first uncapped, unmetered product for Sky Muster. That resulted from a trial of a number of consumers who actually found that it significantly improved their services. I also want to talk about the virtuous cycle here when it comes to that technology. By fibring up more areas, we can move more customers off the fixed line network, and we can move more customers off the satellite network and in turn upgrade their technologies to something that may be more suitable for them. But in terms of the LEOsats, the low Earth orbit satellites, I established a LEOsat working group with industry so that we better understand where these challenges are and how they are serving consumers' needs. I also announced recently a review of the universal service obligation, not to question whether or not it needed to be updated to be fit for purpose, but to look at specific solutions and new initiatives that could be put in place. And the role of LEOsats will certainly form part of that consideration. I think it's important to recognise that the Sky Muster service provided by NBN Co provides an important, affordable backstop for many rural and regional customers. And of course, the rise of LEOsats over recent years has enabled some customers for whom this is well suited for them to take advantage of that technology. But at the same time, NBN Co has this obligation to provide its services to Australians. We will take the lessons from not only the LEOsat working group, but as these satellites near end of life, decisions will need to be made about their future. But you can rest assured that they will be very well informed, not only by technological developments as they exist at any point in time, but above all else, what is in the long-term interests of consumers to have reliable broadband irrespective of where they live or work.
Thank you.
Minister, are you happy to take a couple more questions? We're just running a little bit over time, but are you happy to keep
Certainly.
Thank you. Marcellus Inalinga.
Minister, Marcellus Inalinga from SBS. The ABC has repeatedly reported on allegation of Telstra mistreating remote Indigenous customers and signing them up for unaffordable bills, causing huge financial stress. How widespread is the issue, and how And what steps is the government prepared to take to stop this happening?
Bulavanaka, thank you very much for your question. It is a matter of public record that Telstra was handed a significant fine a number of years ago for mis-selling products to consumers who could not afford them and for whom it was inappropriate to sell those products. I know that within Telstra and the industry more generally, this has been a wake-up call to lift their game. I'd also like to report, as I alluded to, members of the First Nations Digital Inclusion Advisory Group are here. One of the key topics that they have been consulting on as they go around Australia, formulating an action plan for digital inclusion for First Nations people, is that very issue of having appropriate affordability and appropriate selling practices. The other point I'd like to make is that earlier this year, I announced that I would put the financial hardship provisions of the Telecommunications Consumer Protections Code into a standard. The reason why I chose to do that was from interacting and listening with advisory groups and advocates who have continued to highlight that it is First Nations people who are often bearing the brunt of not having appropriate services and appropriate terms of service explained or provided to them. So that is being done now. It is not only, I stress, First Nations Australians who have been victims in this area, but it does highlight an important cohort that we are seeking to protect.
No worries, thank you.
Our final question is from Monty Boswell.
Hello, Minister. Monty Bovell from the ABC. Thank you for your address. You've expressed a concern about increasing hate speech online, particularly on social media platform X. I guess, how has the platform been responsive? Has the platform been responsive to the government here? And would you go a step further and urge Australians to not use that platform?
Well, thank you very much for your question. And in discussing X, I think there's important to make two distinctions here. Firstly, in relation to their conduct, for which they are challenging actions that have been taken by eSafety, that is a separate matter in relation to compliance with code provisions. And I know that that is subject to legal challenge, so I won't provide running commentary on it. But I do note that that is occurring under that rubric of the codes process. In relation to hate speech, what I have done today in announcing consultation on updating the expectations is to draw hate speech into that rubric. So this will be the first time under the BOS, the Basic Online Safety Expectations, that we will have a requirement on the platforms to report against what they may have for their own systems and policies for regulating hate speech. I do believe this is an area that has been underdone for too long. It is clearly an area of concern. It threatens our social cohesion, particularly in the current environment. And the government has determined that we need to take action in this area.
Please join me in thanking the Minister for her address today.